Hare Om Namaha. The following quotation is an excerpt from Organized Religion, written by Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Swāmī Prabhupāda. Quote, "The materialist has a natural repugnance for the transcendent. The church which has the best chances for survival in this damned world is that of atheism under the convenient guise of theism. The idea of an organized church in an intelligible form indeed marks the close of the living spiritual movement." Unquote. Śrīla Siddhanta Sarasvatī was not favorable to organized religion, or as he calls it, the organized church. The title of his article indicates clearly the direct link between organized religion, represented as an organized church, but we should not conclude that his critique of quote-unquote Christianity is that alone. Please note an apparent contradiction, emphasis on the adjective, that before he departed physical manifestation at the beginning of 1937, his Gaudiya Math mission was very well organized. The conclusion is not at all difficult to discern. If there is an Uttama Adhikari leading his own branch of the Hare Krishna movement from the Chaitanya tree, from the unbroken line of disciplic succession in the Brahma Mattva Gaudiya Sampradaya, then the more organized at every level his mission is, the better. The next question is, what about after he departs physical manifestation? In that eventuality, if his leading secretaries carefully followed the founder Acharya's instructions and expressed intentions and desires, the mission continues on as a branch of disciplic succession. That should not be misconstrued to be an organized religion. We get a hint from the following comment by Prabhupada, quote, "Group of individuals can remain, provided they are all devotees. But if the group of individuals, if they are all rogues and rascals, they cannot be representative of God. But either singular or plural, if all of them or single, actually representative of God, abiding by the laws, that is actual religion or law. And if we manufacture our own ways without reference to the God's program, it will be useless and failure," unquote. This excerpt must be understood in context of its application. It's from a critique of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was all about the supremacy of the monarch, who obviously is an individual. When he leaves the scene, then a group of his closest executors, confidants, and advisors can and must carry on the government until the emergence of the next monarch. They act as group regents. Relative to that example proposed by Hobbes, when applied to the context of our chief theme in this presentation, after the founder Acharya departs, his leading secretaries can carry on the mission as Madhyam Adhikaris until the next Uttama Adhikari emerges. Obviously, this is provided that they are all Madhyams and do not fall down from that platform. A Madhyam Adhikari is a very perfect man. He is automatically both a Vartma Pradarshaka Guru and a Shiksha Guru in our branch of the Hare Krishna movement. He may or may not be a Diksha Guru based upon whether or not he has received the order from Prabhupada to initiate, to transmit the Bhakti-lata Bij to newcomers into a connection with the disciplic succession. Prabhupada's ISKCON movement was, despite some speed bumps, well organized in its initial years of functioning. It was well organized, but to a different and lesser extent, after he departed physical manifestation in November of 1977. If his leading secretaries at that time had been pure and dedicated to his orders, his general instructions, and his expressed wishes, the movement could have and would have been carried on in a genuine way. It would have done so until the next Mahabhagavat emerged. Those leading secretaries of ISKCON, however, were not Madhyams, and it did not carry on in a bona fide way. It was transformed. This has become well known. However, the principle still remains intact, as misuse of a great principle or a great science does not render it useless. In other words, Prabhupada's cult of Bhakti Yoga back in the day should not be confused with the organized religions that predominate the world at this time, and these are the three Abrahamic religions. Neither Gaudiya Mat nor Prabhupada's ISKCON mission were ever to be considered organized religions like that until one of them, the mothership, deviated after he departed and became a pseudo-bhakti cult. However, ISKCON, when it later became guided by the self-interests of deviant leaders, could become perverted to such an extent that it would be converted into another organized religion, and this is exactly what happened. It is particularly the case since the emergence of the second transformation, the Collegiate Compromise in the mid-80s, when that change upended the zonal debacle. It's even worse now. It is even more of an organized religion now, since the Collegiate Compromise was transformed into the Hindu hodgepodge sometime in the first decade of the 21st century. None of these transformations were envisioned by the founder Prabhupada. None of them were or are authorized. They were and are all warped transformations of his bhakti cult. It was, as already mentioned, organized to a significant extent, but never anywhere near to the point of being an organized religion. Next question. Was Prabhupada himself favorable to organized religion? The following example gives us something to consider in this connection. Quote, "Everyone has got his personal religion, and there are the hippies also. They are against any organized religion. It is a fact that you cannot make an organized religion by your concoction. So actually, those who are religious, they have no difference of opinion because religion means enacted by God. God is one. So not that God makes one kind of religion for one kind of person and another kind of religion for another person." Unquote. Prabhupada's comment appears to be ambivalent in terms of the question as to whether or not he was favorable to organized religion. However, it really is not. He was against any conditioned soul forming his own religion from his own individual concoction, that's all. Prabhupada inspired a worldwide manifestation of the Hare Krishna movement. It had to be organized, and it was. His employment of Rithviks to conduct the initiation ceremonies on his behalf was an authorized adaptation as the movement expanded by early 1970 to such an extent that he could no longer personally conduct those fire sacrifices for all of the new people coming to him to become initiated. Certainly, a significant amount of centralized organization was required in putting that adaptation into effect. As long as his sannyasis, brahmins, and leading secretaries remained loyal to him, loyal to his general instructions, loyal to his specific orders, and his stated intentions and desires, no problem. The more effective the organization, the better. However, spiritual advancement for the initiated disciples of a bona fide guru is always personal. It was through pleasing, or better yet, impressing the spiritual master in their adherence to the rules and regulations, their application of the rituals, and most importantly, their seva to him, their personal seva to him, that his movement ran well. Their sevas were not to the institution or the governing body. The real workers were not trying to climb the latticework of the bureaucracy, which was very minimal until after Prabhupada left the scene. The institution, which is a passive entity, a form, served the needs and desires of the active principle. And those were the devotees engaged in important personal seva to His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedānta Swāmī Prabhupāda. If you foolishly believe that this arrangement was a form of an organized religion, then there is little that your host speaker can do to disabuse you of such a wrong notion. The movement did not function at all like the organized religions of the three Western Abrahamic Mlechatharmas. It was never designed to do so, and it did not do so. However, you need some perspective in relation to organized religion and genuine bhakti cults. They are very different. They have different strengths and different weaknesses. Bhakti cults can easily be destroyed by the host civilizations that allow them to exist within them as countercultures. They can also rather easily be destroyed by wars or major upheavals in those material host cultures. Organized religion, on the other hand, is difficult to destroy. Genuine bhakti cults are linked to transcendental energies and entities, whereas organized religions are linked to the three modes of material nature. All civilizations functioning at this time, and such has been the case for centuries, are seeped in the three modes of material nature, particularly the two lower modes. There is a kind of stability, a kind of endurance provided by functioning in any mundane civilization, while its prominent religion or religions are situated in its same lower modes. Genuine bhakti cults have no such anchor in the modes, and they do not try to attain it. As such, they are more easily subject to be overridden, scattered, and destroyed in due course of time, and sometimes that due course of time is quite quickly. Have you noticed something also connected to this fact? The three chief deviations since the disappearance of His Divine Grace are the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, the mothership, Neomat, and Ritvik. Before you become aware of what each of them is religiously linked to, a brief introductory explanation is required. Christianity is one of the three Abrahamic organized religions. It has immense sway throughout the many, if not most, of the countries of the world. It is very powerful in Western Europe and North America, obviously. Hinduism has representation and sway throughout the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, although its influence is certainly not limited to that region. The Gaudiya Math had immense influence throughout India, which is very populated. After the Gaudiya Math's founder, Prabhupada's Guru Maharaj, left the scene, its influence gradually diminished for various reasons via schism. So-called ISKCON has now linked itself to Hinduism strongly. Ritvik linked itself to Christianity, somewhat covertly, and Neomat, very obviously, linked itself to the leadership of Gaudiya Math. The three chief deviations from Prabhupada's movement, which simply appear to be succeeding and representing his movement and him after his departure from physical manifestation, are all now linked to different organized religions that are rooted in the modes of material nature. So-called ISKCON is the first of the three, but it did not forge any link with mundane religion until recently. It then gained material strength via Hinduization. Affiliations with Hinduism, Gaudiya Math, and Christianity secures for the three of these deviated movements, respectively, a kind of material stability in the host cultures. In due course, an inexorable decline will kick in with Neomat and Ritvik, but in this presentation, we're focusing upon so-called ISKCON. We are focusing on its conversion into an organized religion, which will not prove to be a successful strategy for that organization in the long run. Now, during the epoch of the Zonal Ācāryas, to a significant degree, so-called ISKCON, in its first conversion from what it was actually meant to be, was not an organized religion except in a kind of minor covert way. The gurus predominated in their zones, but that unauthorized scheme of those zones was instituted by the GBC, the vitiated GBC. As such, a touch of evil of organized religion was present in the zonal debacle in order for it to function. Now, where organized religion took over was in the second transformation of the Collegiate Compromise. By that time, which was the mid-80s, the concoction of organized religion had already crept into the zonal paradigm in an ever-increasing way. Despite resistance from the 11 great pretenders, a backlash from the non-guru section in the movement led to some compromises. Still, organized religion really entered and took over when there was a massive rebellion by the temple presidents. And then the gurus were busted down from Uttama Adhikari to Madhyam Adhikari. This was solidified beyond question in 1987, although it was already transpiring the year before. But please note, none of those gurus had been Uttamas, so actually they weren't busted down. They were just what they always were since 1978. Sahajas. However, when all of the recognized institutional Diksha gurus who remained loyal to the vitiated GBC after this change went completely under the thumb of the Commish, that constituted the victory of organized religion having prevailed in so-called ISKCON. The bureaucracy, which had been expanding during the first half of the 80s, now had a long runway to work with, and let me tell you, it took full advantage of it. The conversion of so-called ISKCON into an organized religion, which then became readily apparent to all serious devotees, mostly on the outside of the cult, of course, that conversion became fixed. The high-profile fake Uttamas were uprooted. Kirtan Ananda still cut that profile at Moundsville, but for all practical purposes, he was no longer connected to so-called ISKCON in any meaningful way. He was, as always, doing his own thing. The leading secretaries of so-called ISKCON did not approve of him, nor did he approve of them. The leaders of the second transformation all became initiating gurus themselves, as long as they did not fall down or engage in a major scandal during the transition of the Collegiate Compromise. As we all know, it was led by Professor Blueblood, as could only have been expected. The colleges and universities throughout the Western world are little more than perverted reflections of organized religion, but now without the theistic base they originally had. And that initially they had been that base for the Church Universal centuries previously. But by the 20th century, that was gone. Professor Blueblood, Ravindra Swarup, dovetailed his institutional acumen in the mundane sphere to the Apasatharma, the semblance of that quote-unquote ISKCON, what it had become, and that effort proved successful for a while. However, it had a bit of an unforeseen Achilles heel to it. Its centers, which were now filled almost completely with the newcomers, the new disciples, all of them improperly initiated, those new people had lost their Uttama gurus. They had been amped up by those great pretenders when they were allegedly Mahabhagavats and worshipped in front of open deities as such in the temple rooms. Now, they were no longer allowed to be worshipped at all, at least not in the temples, maybe in a private quarter. The new disciples had been addicted to them and to their high profiles and powerful statuses, and this had been taken away. As such, the new people were negatively impacted. Most of them were collectors, pickers, and almost all of them lost their mojo. The centers, especially the major centers in the larger metropolitan areas, they were expensive to run. With the great gurus, in the eyes of their disciples only, of course, with those great gurus now relegated to a lower platform, those fanatical followers out in the pick either were no longer willing to go out there in the field or, at the very least, they'd collect for many less hours. They were also not as enthusiastic to collect because they were no longer doing so for a fully realized spiritual master in their minds. The North American Temple Presidents Association, NATPA, had busted down the high-flying gurus. Once the transformation was complete, if the president of any center had been a part of NATPA, which most of them were, especially in America, the incentive to collect for him and his center by the new people was minimized. This led to a revenue problem for many, if not most, of the, air quotes, ISKCON centers. By the early 90s, another major problem emerged: the appearance of the Ritvik concoction. When many high-profile gurus were exposed in the mid-80s, they were forced to toe the line of the new dispensation or be de jure or de facto excommunicated. Kirtanananda was the exception, but he had all kinds of other difficulties emerging due to his ordered assassination of a nemesis by one of his hatchet men. He also was almost killed himself by a former follower and suffered lingering repercussions to his physical and mental well-being as a result. So he really wasn't a big problem. Ritwik provided a different explanation as to why all of these cult problems had emerged, especially the revenue problem. The second transformation allowed new initiates meaning since 1978, to remain allegedly initiated, and of course actually improperly initiated, as long as their busted down gurus remain loyal to the new dispensation brought in by the vitiated GBC. And the commish did not accept Ritwik. As a side note, it's amazing to me that the original Ritviks thought there was any chance the commish would accept it. But anyway, that's a tangent. Ritwik claimed that the only initiations that could possibly be bona fide were those performed by Ritviks on behalf of Prabhupada after he departed physical manifestation. This is not at all what the Collegiate Compromise stood for, of course. The improperly initiated disciples of gurus, those gurus who were no longer connected to so-called ISKCON, were being strong-armed into what soon became known as quote-unquote reinitiation. Most of the new people were not at all attracted to this pressure. At the same time, they did not want to leave the centers in order to become contaminated on the outside by the sinful host culture. Many, if not most of them, buckled under the pressure by accepting another initiation from the ever-expanding list of rent acharyas approved by the vitiated GBC. There was no attractive alternative for these unfortunates. The vast majority of those new people, basically the totality of them, were not into Niyamut for reasons that were completely understandable, as Niyamut was anything but Prabhupada-centered, and they were Prabhupada-centered, at least through their so-called guru. It seemed that the newcomers, the unfortunates, that they had no viable choice but to stay in so-called ISKCON, and such remained the case for about 4 years. They had no choice until Maya arranged for them to have another choice. And that was with the emergence of Ritwik. As such, the ruling class of so-called ISKCON was now faced with fighting on two new and unexpected fronts. Lack of revenue due to massive loss of enthusiasm on the part of the collectors, and very soon after, defections of their new people to Ritwik and its so-called gurus. Those unauthorized Ritwik gurus, please note, Ritwik came to a close permanently in the middle of November 1977. Those unauthorized Ritwik gurus gave all of their new initiates a mirror to reflect what appeared to be the moon. Those new people, almost the totality of which were not very educated in the spiritual science of Krishna consciousness, and thus still prone to be cheated, looked into that mirror they were given by the Ritwik leaders. In it, they saw the reflection of the moon. They thus concluded, due to bad association, that they had captured the moon. They went from one subset of bad association to another one, and were thus plunged into heresy. Tatvamasi. While in latter-day so-called ISKCON, some of these unfortunates had received as many as 3 reinitiations, which is bonkers. Now with Ritvik, they subjected themselves to but another ceremonial throwing of the bananas and rice into the fire. They now wrongly believed that they had secured his divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedānta Swāmī Prabhupāda, a non-manifest spiritual master, as their new Diksha gurus. So-called ISKCON, already in need of the revenue they lost with the lack of incentive from their collectors, many of whom had been big time, out in the field for 16-hour shifts. Now they lost even more membership. Those new people held grudges for what the mothership had done to their beloved first guru, and with that resentment, they joined Ritvik. And that resentment was fed by their new Ritvik leaders. Those misleaders also had broiling resentment against the air quotes ISKCON upper echelon for not granting them Diksha Guru status. Due to the well-worn policy of cult stratification that was always in place since the late 60s, the stratification tactic was still there. Not unsurprisingly, the Vaishnav journal emerged in so-called ISKCON. It was, at least superficially, somewhat favorable to Gaudiya Mutt, which meant so-called ISKCON was lessening its opposition to Neo Mutt, which of course also rejected Ritvik. This effort to align with Neo Mutt failed rather quickly, so so-called ISKCON had to come up with something new. It was a time for another change. That change was the third transformation. It solidified even further so-called ISKCON's conversion into an organized religion. First, some backstory is in order. For all practical purposes, the first transformation came in with a bang. It was introduced quite abruptly. It was decided for certain when the GBC converted into the vitiated GBC in the last week of March 1978. By no later than May of that year, all but one center worldwide was under the full whammy of the heady, high-flying Great 11 Pretender Mahabhagavats. All the inmates in the centers, and of course the new people that had arrived there just after Prabhupada left the scene, were now worshiping in front of open deities and temple rooms pseudo-Mahabhagavats. The zonal debacle came in as the equivalent of a kind of smash and grab. It was their way or the highway. You were out if you showed any resistance to it. Except for the Krishna Balaram complex in Ramanreti, the zonal debacle was complete and the die was cast. Bottom line, for the purposes of this part of our presentation, the zonal imposition did not gradually work its way into the takeover that it consummated. Instead, it came in as an abrupt shock to the system. The second transformation was not very abrupt. It took some time. It was gradual from one perspective, but it caught fire in 1986. It had been on warm the previous 2 years and simmering. By 1987, it was the law of the land. From a different perspective of scale, the change came in somewhat quickly, as it only took 3 years to replace the zonals. And now we come to the third transformation of the Hinduization of so-called ISKCON. And the rest of our monthly podcast will focus upon this massive expansion of organized religion in so-called ISKCON. It took over very gradually. The camel got his nose under the tent and came in slowly, to the extent that hardly anyone can pinpoint the year in which the Hinduization made it to the top of the turtle tank. It took over at the Bhaktivedānta Manor in England in the mid-90s. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 2005, it either had a foothold in virtually every ISKCON center or some kind of influence. Now, India is the land of disparity. You travel by its 19th century railroad carriages through various places. For about 500 yards, you will experience wonderfully scented air from fresh flowers and nice scenery. Then all of a sudden, the next 500 yards greets you with the smell of open sewage and run-down shacks. Particularly, this is experienced on the rail line between New Delhi and Mathura, but such disparity is certainly not limited to that patch of land. The disparity in wealth throughout the subcontinent of India is mind-boggling. Everyone knows this. Hindus dominate that subcontinent and its culture, and no one will dispute this. However, Hinduism has also become somewhat influential in the West, and especially now in so-called ISKCON. Since Hinduism colors the, air quotes, ISKCON movement, we must not only understand why, but also just what it is and what it is not. Hinduism is not Krishna consciousness, nor is it monotheistic, as some falsely claim. Those who state with apparent conviction that Hinduism is monotheistic are pushing mistaken knowledge. Such mistaken knowledge is easily accepted in America, unfortunately. Just as importantly, even if it was or is monotheistic, which again, it has never been, is not now, nor ever will be, even if it was monotheism, monotheism is not the absolute truth. Hinduism is rooted in Mayavad. In fact, it is a third simulacrum of heavy-duty Shankara Mayavad. Hinduism is neither monotheistic nor is it pantheistic. It is henotheistic. I shall simply mention the difference between all of these, although that is not important to the philosophical, procedural, historical, and practical factors regarding Hinduism's takeover of so-called ISKCON, which, as you know, is its third transformation. The chief reason the Hindus were able to become so influential is that Hinduism solved the revenue problem that virtually all of the so-called ISKCON centers suffered when the Collegiate Compromise took over. The Hindus in the Western world are, with very few exceptions, they're wealthy. They're well off. They know how to obey the laws and take advantage of the opportunities the West provides them. You never hear about Hindu gangs in the West because there aren't any. They're law-abiding, successful citizens in the Western meritocratic environment in which they now domicile. They had no presence or influence in ISKCON, at least not in America, when devotees joined the movement in the late 60s, early 70s, and the mid-70s before Prabhupada departed. While your host speaker was at the Chicago Center, at most a Hindu would visit either as one man or with his immediate family. On the Sunday Love Feast, he would drop a 5 or a 10 in the Dana box, and that'd be it. They had no interest in joining. They were attracted to the deities and nothing more. During my early years in the movement, I only had contact with one former Hindu, about my same age, and initiated by Prabhupada almost at the same time. He joined and became a full-fledged Vaishnava neophyte devotee. Like myself, He eventually became the temple president of Ahmedabad, and he was recognized by Prabhupada to a significant extent, but he was no longer a Hindu. He was a Vaishnava. Now, what is Hinduism? As already mentioned, it is neither monotheism nor is it completely united philosophically amongst its members. It's all over the place. As far as its basic platform, shared by pretty much all of its acolytes, it's a combination of henotheism and Vivartavad. It gets Vivartavad from Mayavad. Henotheism means worship of many demigods, and dyed-in-the-wool Hindus considered the Parameshvara, Lord Vishnu or Krishna, to be one of the prominent demigods only. Hindus select their Ishtadeva from a package of Vedic Deva options, and that's not Vaishnavism. Now, some select Krishna or Vishnu, of course, but those Hindus have the wrong conception of Parameshvara. Monotheism is the wrong concept that God does everything, and it rejects that demigods carry on the functions of the universe, especially on earth. In point of fact, 33 million of them do just that, while the Supreme Controller simply witnesses and sanctions the cosmic karma playing out under the control of his appointed demigods. Monotheism is nonsense. God does not have to do all of that work, and he does not do so. Henotheism is also nonsense, because all of the demigods recognize Lord Vishnu as the supreme controller, and they recognize that he controls them as well. That means that Lord Vishnu can, and sometimes does, punish them if they do not carry out the administration of his universe in the right way, although such punishment is rare. Now we come to Vivartavad, and Vivartavad is nonsense. The idea that everything in the universe is an illusion, that it's unreal, that has its roots in Mayavad. The actual philosophy, the absolute truth in terms of philosophy, and the absolute truth that's promulgated by all Vaishnavas is called Parinamavad, not Vivartavad. The philosophy of Vaishnavism is panentheism. Let me repeat that, please. The absolute philosophy, the absolute truth, what the Vaishnavas hold as the absolute truth, is panentheism, which is entirely different from either monotheism or henotheism. Everything in the universe is real, but it's temporary. The actual creations, while they last, are not illusory. While it lasts, the universe is real. It is not to be dismissed as a figment of imaginary creation, and that is ultimately not real at all, but just a mirror, a reflection, an illusion. It's not that. Now, the material manifestation is not reality, but it does have existence while it lasts, along with all of its creations while they last. The Hindus who do not believe in samsara being forever, and that's probably the majority, they instead believe that mukti or moksha is the ultimate goal. This, they believe, is ultimately merging into Brahman, the white light of eternity. That merging is known as Sayuja Mukti, and it is completely transcendental to material existence. It is also called Brahma Nirvana. And that's the ultimate goal of Hindus, but Vaishnavas will never accept Sayuja Mukti. Never. They want to transcend it in order to reach eternal deliverance in the spiritual world of form and activity. But Hindus believe that the attainment of form of activity anywhere is Maya, and they believe that attaining it, the form and activity, is previous to Sayuja Mukti, which it's not. Sayuja Mukti comes first. In other words, There is a vast difference between a follower of Hinduism and a Vaishnava. Vast. The Hindu is henotheistic. He believes in Vivartavad, and he thinks that merging into Brahman as a liberated spiritual spark is the only ultimate real liberation. And of course, as we all know from some of those gurus who came in the 60s, the Hindu thinks that if they merge, they then become God himself or itself. The Vaishnava, on the other hand, adheres to panentheism, preaches Parinamavad, and wants to reach the spiritual world where his Svarup Siddhi and Rasa with Lord Narayan or Lord Krishna functions in the everlasting world of form and activity, and this is real worship, and it is called devotional service or bhakti. The introduction of Hinduism into so-called ISKCON was never the intention of its founder, the founder of the real movement. And now I'm going to offer you a number of clear excerpts from Prabhupada's statements and his writings that prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I'm going to add some commentary after each of them, although they really don't require it, because in and of themselves they're crystal clear. Quote, "They are of the opinion that one can become an incarnation simply by worshiping a demigod. This philosophical hodgepodge exists under the name of the Hindu religion, but the Krishna Consciousness movement does not approve of it. Indeed, we strongly condemn it. Such worship of demigods and so-called incarnations of God should never be confused with the pure Krishna Consciousness movement," unquote. My commentary. Devotees of Lord Vishnu or Lord Krishna do not worship the demigods, although Vaishnavas recognize that, materially speaking, the demigods are far more powerful than them. As such, Vaishnavas never go out of their way to offend the demigods, but devotees of the Supreme Lord reject the henotheism intrinsic to Hinduism. Devotees know clearly that they're eternally subordinate to the Supreme Lord, the Parameshvara. Now we go to another quote from Prabhupada. Quote, "The Hindu centers in the foreign countries, none of them are bona fide. There is a similar hodgepodge center in London. Actually, Hindus and non-Hindus, everyone is at the present moment out of touch of the real science of spiritual knowledge," unquote. My commentary. The real Krishna conscious movement established by His Divine Grace Prabhupada was meant to invoke knowledge and realization, jnana and vijnana, in the cultivation of spiritual life and spiritual science. This gets lost when Hinduism degrades it. Actually, once the zonal imposition was implemented, cultivating spiritual science was no longer even viable for most devotees. It was certainly anything but a priority. The Hindu hodgepodge solidifies this trend of not invoking interest in understanding spiritual science, but instead replacing that with the sentimentality that is integral to Hinduism. Next quote from Prabhupada. Quote, "So far my writings avoid publishing them in hodgepodge journals. These so-called Hindus are generally impersonalists, and we do not want to have anything to do with them," unquote. Current so-called ISKCON encourages Hindus in their lifestyles and beliefs. It depends upon Hindu money to a significant extent at many, if not most, of its centers. It recognizes, like just recently Diwali, it recognizes Hindu festival days and engages in something as wacky as car pooj after some Hindu member of its congregation purchases a classy new vehicle. Some Hindus even control ISKCON centers as temple presidents. Next quote from Prabhupada. Quote, Other than the bona fide Vaishnava functions, we cannot divert our attention to such participation in so-called religious functions. This has spoiled the Hindu religion into a hodgepodge pseudo-religion, unquote. My comment. So-called ISKCON became a pseudo-religion once the zonal debacle took over in the late 70s. Now it's in its third transformation from what it was actually meant to be. That third transformation is the Hinduization of so-called ISKCON. And hopefully almost everyone has recognized that by now. So now we're going to go to a talk that Prabhupada had with a guest. Quite possibly he was a Hindu, but anyway, we don't know for sure. Question from a guest. How do you relate the International Society for Krishna Consciousness to Hinduism? How would you describe it? As a part of Hinduism? Prabhupada, no. Hinduism practically we do not recognize because this word Hinduism is not mentioned in any Vedic literature. It is a foreign term. Otherwise, we don't find that word in any Vedic literature. My comment. Hinduism has no place in Vaishnavism. It's a concoction. It is not mentioned in any authorized Vedic literature. Everything it stands for, except some weak sentiment about Lord Krishna, which only some Hindus share, is opposed to the real Sanatana Dharma of Vaishnavism. We proceed to the next quote, brief quote by Prabhupada. Quote, we are against all so-called cheating religion. The Hinduism is also a cheating religion, unquote. My comment. Hinduism is a Kaitava Dharma. It's not a Mleccha Dharma, although some Hindus in the West have degraded to meat eating. Hinduism is different and better than the three Abrahamic religions, but it's still a cheating religion. So-called ISKCON, by allowing Hinduism to become as influential in its movement as it has, will lead the cult to its inexorable decline. Next quote by Prabhupada. This Hindu religion has no philosophy. Therefore, it has died. Because in this age, people have become very much hardened by material living, and they are not much interested in sentimental religions like Hinduism. Sentiments are temporary, and they always dry up, unquote. The colossal hoax of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It is now in the throes of its third transformation. It became an organized apasadharma during its second transformation. And the influence of Hinduism in its superstructure now and its worship programs solidifies it even more firmly as an organized religion. It has greatly diminished its chances to fulfill the prophecy of Lord Chaitanya by allowing Hindu influence, set previously into motion by the institutional compromises engendered from its bureaucracy. It is now its own kind of church, the organized Eastern religion in intelligible form. Sadeva Samya,